Mrs. Kennedy had just attended a breakfast of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. At the airport in Fort Worth, before taking off for Dallas, the Kennedys, as they have been prone to do all along on this Texas trip, went to the fence railing to shake hands with well-wishers and to allow some pictures to be taken. The President and Mrs. Kennedy both had looked particularly refreshed and rested yesterday during their trip to San Antonio and Houston, and again this morning as they started to leave Fort Worth. Democratic congressmen accompanying the President on his trip were right behind him and Mrs. Kennedy, and the two boarded Air Force One at Carswell Air Force Base for the 30-mile air trip from Fort Worth to Dallas. It had been a rather gray morning a little bit earlier in the day as a cold front moved across Texas, and there had been some rain. Laden skies and that little bit of rain were giving way to brilliant sunshine just about, an hour before the President's scheduled arrival time at Dallas's Love Field. This was the crowd at Love Field, a particularly large greeting crowd. It was described that way by Dallas police and Mayor Earl Cabell. It's ironic that the rain stopped before the President's arrival in Dallas. Had it continued raining, a bulletproof bubble top which fits over the sleek presidential convertible would have undoubtedly been used today and possibly would have prevented the assassination. But as the sunshine broke through, President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived in Dallas to be greeted by a line of local dignitaries. A very enthusiastic crowd was on hand. Local reporters who've covered many of these gatherings called it one of the largest airport greetings in Dallas history. Mrs. Kennedy was given a bouquet of roses. Mrs. Kennedy seemed to enjoy shaking hands with the local populace a bit more today than she did yesterday in San Antonio and Houston, when there were times yesterday when Mrs. Kennedy appeared to be a little ill at ease. This morning she was all smiles and very warm in her greetings, as was the President. Of course, the President used to such occasions. The President spent what seemed to be a rather long time at the Dallas airport making sure that he shook hands with everyone who was on hand there. As far as the dignitaries were concerned, always taking time, of course, to introduce his wife. Because of the rather long time spent at the airport, the President was a bit late at getting started on his motorcade through downtown Dallas. They took time out at the airport to greet an elderly lady who said she had lived 69 years without shaking hands with the President. She got her chance today. The Secret Service, all during this Texas trip, had been allowing photographers and newsmen, local press, as distinguished from the White House news contingent, to work very closely around the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The presidential couple went again to the fence railing in Dallas to greet the well-wishers, departing from the course marked out for them by Secret Service people. But of course, President Kennedy had made something of a reputation as a man who liked to break away and shake hands with well-wishers and the crowds who gathered to see him. These are some of the last close-up pictures taken of President Kennedy. He was literally mobbed as he and Mrs. Kennedy went to that fence railing at Love Field. The crowd at the Dallas airport was, to a large measure, a young crowd. The teenage group, which played such a prominent role in President Kennedy's 1960 campaign. Youngsters of the teen age were very much in abundance at the airport. Mrs. Kennedy carried with her the entire time at the airport the roses that had been given to her. Then the presidential couple entered the open Lincoln convertible in which they rode with Governor and Mrs. John Connolly. Of course, Governor Connolly also was shot in the convertible. In the convertible, 2 Secret Service agents driving it. Immediately behind them, Governor and Mrs. John Connolly of Texas. And then in the rear seat, the President and Mrs. Kennedy. The plan in Dallas was to go from the airport with a rather slow motorcade so that everyone would have a chance to look, applaud, and take pictures of the President and Mrs. Kennedy. To go along Lemon Street, which is one of Dallas's main streets, then cut over to Main Street, and go down to Main Street after circling through the downtown area out to the Trade Mart, where the President was due to make a speech. Pictures are further downtown than the scene where the actual shooting took place. Then the shots rang out. The presidential motorcade speeded up. The President was rushed immediately to Parkland Hospital. This is the rear entrance to the hospital through which the President's car was brought. There are the roses Mrs. Kennedy had been carrying. They were on the floor. They had gotten there in the car as Mrs. Kennedy put the head of her mortally wounded husband on her lap. This is the interior of the convertible. Dallas law enforcement officers and Secret Service men, along with Congressman Jim Wright, Democratic Senator Ralph Yarborough, were all on hand at the rear of the hospital. The law enforcement people and the Secret Service men kept photographers, newsmen, and the curious as far away from the rear of the hospital as they possibly could. Congressman Wright there in a moment of grief. A large crowd gathered at Parkland Hospital as word spread that the President had been shot. There was considerable disbelief at first that he had actually been shot. Some thought he simply had taken ill. This is the new and modern Parkland Hospital with some of the best facilities in this part of the country, to which the President was taken after he was shot. This is the ambulance that carried the President in, moving away. A tight security guard was placed around the automobile. There are some of the aides and 1 or 2 doctors, I believe, rushing into the hospital. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was one of the last to see President Kennedy arrive, gave reporters some early details. These were long moments at Parkland Hospital as everyone waited for word on how is the President. Hospital sources gave this report of the arrival at the emergency entrance to the hospital, and I quote from the hospital: "The President was lying motionless in the car. Mrs. Kennedy was leaning over him, holding him. Governor Connolly was leaning back in the seat, holding his stomach. Both men were covered with blood. Inside the emergency room, witnesses said the First Lady, splattered with blood, entered without a word. Mrs. Kennedy reportedly held up very well inside. She was heard only to say, 'Jack, Jack, no, no.' Even regular hospital attendants were barred admittance to the emergency room as a bevy of doctors worked frantically over President Kennedy. At the same time this scene was going on at Parkland Hospital, all around town, police, sheriff's deputies, and Secret Service men were following every possible lead, every possible clue in an effort to come up with some kind of lead to the assassin. Governor Yarborough, after checking inside in the emergency room, came out and told reporters that he simply didn't know whether the President was still alive or not. The Washington press corps and newsmen in general were, of course, pressing for some kind of word, some kind of detail. Things began to get crowded despite police efforts there at the rear of the hospital, the emergency room. At the moment these pictures were taken, it was known that the President was in serious, perhaps critical condition. It was not known that he was dead. All around the hospital, the faces of the crowd that gathered told the story. This is part of the motor entourage which I believe brought 2 Roman Catholic Church priests to the hospital. The crowd now has gotten the word. The word has been received that President Kennedy is dead. There were some others wounded at the scene of the shooting. They were brought in much later. Very shortly after it was announced that the president had died, a local ambulance pulled up to the hospital, and about the time it did arrive to carry the body of President Kennedy away, Presidential Press Assistant Malcolm Kilduff held a press briefing and made the announcement that the president was officially dead. He also explained the seating arrangement in the automobile in which the president had taken part in the motorcade along with Governor and Mrs. John Connally. This was a seating arrangement, the Secret Service, 2 Secret Service men in front, the Connollys in the middle, President and Mrs. Kennedy in the rear. President Kennedy was sitting on the right-hand side as you looked onto that car from the top side. The shot apparently was fired from about 1 block away from what is believed to have been a